The story began with Lee Gun, the main character, striking down the final monster he had been battling for the past 20 years. The creature screamed for help, calling out desperately for others, but it was too late. Lee Gun had already slaughtered every last one. Now, standing alone among the corpses, he finally whispered, "It's over," as the area around him crumbled into dust, leaving only the remains of his old shop. He realized that the nightmare had truly ended. At last, he was free to leave the tower that had imprisoned him. For 2 decades, he could finally relax. But to understand how it all began, one had to go back to the final day of the 20th century. That was when humanity first faced the great disaster known as misfortune. These otherworldly beings descended upon the earth, plunging the world into chaos and fear. At humanity's darkest hour, 12 beings calling themselves the holy gods appeared. They offered salvation, promising to share their divine powers with selected humans to fight back against the disasters. In reality, though, their motives weren't so noble. These gods handpicked 12 individuals known as the Awakened to bestow their powers upon. But then something unexpected happened. A 13th Awakened appeared, one who received no blessings from any god yet wielded power far beyond the others. That man was Lee Gun. Lee Gun had gained infamy not just for his unmatched strength, but for his attitude. He once joked that he showed up just to slap those who didn't subscribe. But behind the humor was a man whose power made even the gods take notice. One night, as Lee Gun and his close friend Hugo were sharing fried chicken over drinks, Hugo made a grim prediction. He told Lee Gun that he would die the next day. Lee Gun wasn't fazed in the slightest. He brushed it off, thinking it was just a joke, especially since he had both drumsticks on his plate. Hugo, however, remained serious, expressing frustration at Lee Gun's nonchalance. Lee Gun simply responded that he appreciated Hugo's concern, but there was no way he'd die, not after killing more misfortunes than the 12 saints combined. The next day, Hugo thanked Lee Gun for making the Demon Tower raid possible. Lee Gun smirked and said gratitude wasn't enough. He demanded 5 years' worth of fried chicken instead. When Hugo asked if he ever got tired of eating the same thing and begged him to stop using his ridiculous nickname, Lee Gun just grinned and said the real name didn't have the right ring to it. Meanwhile, the saints, those blessed by the 12 gods, were fantasizing about the massive rewards they'd earn for defeating the Red Eye, a legendary misfortune considered the worst of them all. One particularly greedy saint suggested asking for $100 million. But Lee Gun, ever practical, or maybe just eccentric, said he'd settle for a 10-year vacation pass to the 7-star Hawaiian hotel. After all, many nations were teetering on bankruptcy thanks to Red Eye's devastation. Still, some saints remained obsessed with wealth and vanity. One of them lamented how he'd never fix his once handsome face and body. After their self-centered banter, they walked off, leaving Lee Gun shaking his head. To him it was clear, they didn't care about innocent lives. They were chasing glory. As they walked away, they even joked that having a few casualties would make the rewards bigger. Disgusted, Lee Gun vowed that after this mission, he'd never work with them again. Soon they reached the Cave of Lava, the entrance to Red Eye's domain. The saints stood frozen in fear as the true form of Red Eye revealed itself. Its mere presence radiated such intense pressure that it overwhelmed them just by sight. But Lee Gun remained calm, even impressed, wondering how such power could come from something they hadn't even fought yet. Suddenly, Red Eye let out a thunderous roar. The entire cave trembled violently. Lava surged beneath their feet, and Lee Gun was caught off guard by a surprise attack. The eruption launched everyone into the air, and a powerful laser burst destroyed the entire fortress around them. As the smoke cleared, a massive lava crater was revealed. Red Eye remained unmoved, sitting on its throne with a wicked grin. In a panic, one of the saints, Sophie, screamed for everyone to run. Chaos followed, as they realized they stood no chance. But Lee Gun didn't move. He simply turned his back to the others, muttering that these so-called saints were nothing but cowards. In his mind, it didn't matter. He could take Red Eye on his own, and with that, he leapt straight toward the monster, ready for battle. After a brutal fight, Lee Gun succeeded in defeating Red Eye, but just as he caught his breath, a sharp pain pierced his back. He'd been stabbed. Someone had betrayed him, The blow sent him plummeting into the abyss below. He didn't know how long he had been trapped in that cursed place. Time moved strangely inside the tower. Days? Years? It didn't matter. Surrounded by endless waves of summoned misfortunes, Lee Gun didn't bother thinking, he only fought. Slash after slash, kill after kill. It was a death trap, a dungeon designed to break him. But he refused to die. Whoever had betrayed him would pay. That he promised himself. 20 years passed. Finally, he stood over the last monster's corpse. With a sigh of relief, he collapsed at the tower's entrance. Outside, the world had changed. Destroyed cities, roaming misfortunes, and people barely clinging to survival. Two scavengers ran for their lives through the ruins, arguing about which direction to take as a high-class misfortune hunted them down. One of them remembered a fortune-teller's warning he would face disaster today. He hadn't taken it seriously. He'd been too busy worrying about money. Just as the monster closed in on them, the ground trembled. The gates of the demon tower glowed with blinding light. The two stopped in their tracks, stunned as the tower exploded with a thunderous blast that carved a crater into the earth. Debris rained down, burying them. Dazed, they peeked out from beneath the rubble, asking the same question, what was that? Far in the distance, an old man stared wide-eyed at the destroyed tower. He pointed at the rising dust and whispered, "Is that a person?" From the haze, a lone figure emerged. Lee Gun stepped forward, his expression dark and unrelenting. His fist clenched tightly. His voice growled, asking who dared stab him in the back and throw him into that trap. His eyes burned with fury, as if he were ready to eat them alive and roast them for dinner. His presence alone radiated like a god descended from ancient martial legends, the kind of warrior who could shake the heavens. And now, he had only one thing on his mind: revenge. The two people stood frozen in awe, struggling to grasp what was happening. In front of them, an overwhelming barrage of punches rained down, unleashed by none other than Lee Gun. Just watching it, they couldn't believe their eyes. Even high-rank awakeners would find it difficult to handle such a monster, yet Lee Gun was treating it like a mere bug. Then Lee Gun glanced in their direction and leapt straight at them. Shocked and terrified, they barely had time to react before he struck. After the attack, they cried out in confusion, asking why he had suddenly targeted them. Lee Gun, equally confused, admitted he had mistaken them for monsters. Finally, after years of being trapped, Lee Gun stepped out of the tower. The weight of 20 years finally lifted from his shoulders. Elsewhere, the younger of the two, still in shock, muttered that it was big news. Someone had actually come out of the tower. The old man, however, scoffed at the idea. "There's no way anyone survived that place," he said. He was probably just nearby when the tower collapsed. But before they could argue further, a massive misfortune-type monster appeared. Both were struck with terror, but Lee Gun didn't even flinch. The old man identified it as the leader of the wolf type. Disasters and urged Lee Gun to run. The beast unleashed a devastating attack, powerful enough to incinerate the entire city in a single breath. To their surprise, they were still alive. Looking up, they saw him, the man, the myth, the living nightmare of the tower, Lee Gun. The old man blinked in disbelief. Could it be? Had this man truly saved them? Lee Gun simply smiled, then launched into the air with the grace of a god and brought down a single, devastating punch. One strike. That was all it took. Just like that, the monster was erased from existence, like a scene straight out of One Punch Man. Afterward, he turned toward the two, calling out to them. Startled, they responded with a nervous, "Yes?" But Lee Gun didn't scold or threaten them. Instead, he asked, with a cheerful grin, if they could buy him food and some new clothes. Next, they were at a restaurant. The old man stared at the bill in disbelief. "Is this real? $1,000 at a snack bar? He ate 120 servings by himself?" Lee Gun casually replied that he barely ate anything, especially since they claimed they were low on funds. The old man exploded again. "How is that a little?" Lee Gun simply grinned. "You said you'd treat me, consider it payment for saving your lives." Then he called out for dessert, noodles this time. Curious, the younger man asked who Lee Gun really was and why he had been near the demon tower. Calmly, Lee Gun replied that he had just come out from the tower. They were stunned. "You were inside that thing?" Before they could process it, Lee Gun turned the question around. He could sense magical energy from them. Aren't you just regular civilians? Why do you have magic? The old man answered that the boy was a Templar and asked if Lee Gun was one too, someone who had awakened through the blessing of a holy god. Lee Gun scoffed. I don't serve any god. As he lifted his spoon, he caught his reflection in its surface and froze. His eyes widened in shock. He immediately demanded a mirror. The girl at the counter pointed to one nearby. Standing in front of it, Lee Gun stared at his reflection. His body completely healed. Scars that should have never vanished were gone. He thought his left arm had been lost for good, but it was back, fully intact. And then he noticed it. A snake-like tattoo coiled around his palm, glowing faintly. It looked alive. A surge of energy rushed through his body, and his vision was suddenly filled with floating panels. One of them declared that he had experienced death and earned an impossible achievement. Another showed that all his existing stats had been transferred into a new body. His accomplishments in the tower were now converted, and he had even formed a divine skill. Then the final message appeared. You are now able to use the power of Ophiuchus. The scene shifted. Lee Gun stood in the spiritual realm, facing an enormous snake figure. Its crimson eyes glowed as it loomed before him. He reached out hesitantly. The moment his fingers made contact, the snake radiated blinding light, and just like that, Lee Gun was back in the real world, dazed and confused. The young man asked if he was okay. Lee Gun blinked. Did you see a snake just now? They looked at each other and shook their heads. No, all we saw was you ripping off your clothes, running to the mirror, and screaming while grabbing your wrist. Lee Gun muttered, so, other people can't see it. That confirmed it. Only he could see the notification panels. Thinking back, Lee Gun figured the transformation was due to his super regeneration skill. He had never heard of something like this happening to the other saints. And most importantly, he couldn't feel the energy of any holy god. Still, whatever had happened, it wasn't a bad thing. His body was fully restored. Now only one thing mattered, finding the one who had stabbed him in the back and thrown him into that trap. A grim expression crossed his face. He was ready. He would have his revenge. Even just standing near him, the two people felt a chill down their spines. Back at the site of the destroyed demon tower, a different pair of individuals watched the smoke and rubble from a distance. The world's going to get noisy soon, one of them said. The demon tower is a symbol tied to Lee Gun, the other noted. Could this be the work of his followers? Or saints who hated him? But even saints have a hard time with high-level misfortune monsters, the first replied. Who would try to take down that many creatures just to destroy the tower? You think Lee Gun really came back? I don't know, came the uncertain response. All we can do now is wait. Elsewhere, reporters swarmed St. Yang Wei, asking what he thought about the tower collapse and whether Lee Gun was truly alive. He refused to comment and quickly left the press room, heading for his car. Inside, his expression darkened. Lee Gun, could he really still be alive? Yang Wei remembered the tower, the monsters. There had been thousands of black-class demonic beasts in that place. Just retrieving the Red Eye's head had nearly been suicide. Lee Gun's body had already been damaged back then, and he didn't even have divine protection like the other 12 saints. If Lee Gun had somehow survived all that, then they were in trouble. And in the next moment, Lee Gun was about to make a call. An airplane had just landed, and a man was seen walking down the stairs. Everyone nearby greeted him with respect. Among the crowd, one person praised the man, bowing deeply, admitting he never thought he'd see one of the 12 saints in person. That man was Hugo. Hugo immediately asked where the Prime Minister was. The greeter informed him that the Prime Minister was waiting at the government office. As Hugo passed by, the security personnel looked at him in awe, murmuring among themselves about how majestic he appeared. One of them remarked, "So that's what a true chosen looks like." Soon after, they drove off at high speed toward the Prime Minister's location. Hugo sat calmly inside the car, quietly gazing at the passing scenery. His phone began to ring, snapping him out of his thoughts. He assumed it was probably reporters again. Rumors had been swirling about Lee Gun being alive. And with a scornful expression, Hugo flipped his phone and muttered that it had been over 20 years. His mind drifted back to the last conversation he had with Lee Gun 2 decades ago. He had told Lee Gun that he would die the next day. Lee Gun had responded with a disappointed smile, accusing Hugo of having little faith in him. He also remembered the fateful day at the Devil's Tower. At Lee Gun's request, Hugo had left the tower to combat the spreading disaster outside. Deep inside, he had hoped that his premonition was wrong and that Lee Gun would return safely, but what followed left him in shock. He asked what had happened to Lee Gun, only to learn that the saint who had entered the tower with him had abandoned him, returning only with the Red Eye's severed head. Despite the betrayal, the 12 saints, including Hugo, were hailed as heroes for their so-called victory and granted power and authority. Hugo, still wounded and filled with disbelief, couldn't accept Lee Gun's death. He repeatedly demanded they continue the search. Jean, another saint, told him it was too much. Jean pointed out the overwhelming number of disaster-type beings that had emerged from the tower, claiming it was unrealistic to think Lee Gun had survived. He warned Hugo that if he insisted on going alone, no one would stop him, but he'd better be prepared for the 12 saints to become 11. Just recalling that memory made Hugo sigh. He told himself that no matter how powerful Lee Gun had been, surviving all this time was impossible. It was simply too late. Suddenly, a screen on the back of the car seat lit up, ringing. The driver informed Hugo that the Prime Minister was calling. Hugo answered and asked what the issue was. The Prime Minister, his voice heavy with urgency, reported that the Devil's Tower had collapsed. Hugo furrowed his brows in concern, wondering if this was just another baseless story being used for attention. He warned that if they were planning to ask him to look for Lee Gun, he would refuse. He stated firmly that Lee Gun had died at the Devil's Tower all those years ago, and whatever was happening now was probably the work of Lee Gun's followers. He also hinted that if this was a stunt to gain political favor, he wouldn't be part of it. But the Prime Minister interrupted him, saying it wasn't like that. He explained that the South Korean government had just received a confirmed report. Not long ago, a particular communication line had been activated, Lee Gun's exclusive direct line. Hugo's face drained of color. He asked, stunned, "What line?" The Prime Minister repeated, "It was Lee Gun's personal, top priority contact line." Hugo froze in shock. He immediately demanded the car be stopped. Frantically, he checked his phone, discovering 30 missed calls and a voice message. Staring at the screen in disbelief, he tapped the voice message he had previously ignored. A chilling voice whispered through the speaker, "I'll find you and kill you. Good luck." His hands trembled. Panic overtook him as he began to believe the impossible. Lee Gun might really be alive. Without hesitation, Hugo shouted for the driver to turn the car around. "We're going back to the airport," he commanded. The driver asked what they should do about the mission in the United Kingdom, but Hugo dismissed it with a yell, "Forget that! Head to the airport now!" Meanwhile, back with the protagonist, Lee Gun, he stared at a phone screen, his expression sinister. He muttered that Hugo had grown so arrogant he was ignoring his calls. A nearby boy asked who he had been trying to contact. Lee Gun casually replied that it was no one important. He then commented on the smartphone, expressing genuine amazement. "So they call this a smartphone? It's incredible," he said, intrigued. He explained that he had entered the Devil's Tower back in 2005, and now, after 20 years, the world seemed completely transformed. The boy, surprised, asked if it was Lee Gun's first time using a smartphone. He excitedly explained that you could also access the internet and watch news on it. Curious, Lee Gun asked if they could check for news related to him. The boy confirmed that Lee Gun had recently become a hot topic. He began teaching Lee Gun how to navigate the phone. Lee Gun was impressed by how quickly news could be accessed. Until he saw the online comments, his expression turned dark. He clenched the phone, furious as he read people praising the 12 saints for defeating the Red Eye while implying that they had abandoned him. With a sigh, he muttered that he should ignore it. It was just noise. But then he came across something else. Talk about his last will. It suddenly came back to him. He had promised that if he died, his entire wealth would be donated to orphanages and scholarships. Eager to verify, he searched for what happened to his estate. What he found left him livid. His wealth had been given to the 12 saints instead. Overcome with rage, Lee Gun crushed the phone in his hand, shouting that he would have his revenge on them and their so-called holy gods. As the shattered phone emitted its last breath, the phone's soul cried out, thanking him for everything up until now. Lee Gun, meanwhile, was lost in thought. Even if he wanted to reveal he had returned, he looked completely different from how he had 20 years ago. No one would believe he was Lee Gun. They'd think he was a lunatic. He decided it would be best to stay quiet for now. Suddenly, he sensed an unusual aura, and a system notification appeared. Someone is watching. Suspicious? Lee Gun stepped out of the store under the pretense of getting fresh air. Outside, he noticed several goat avatars lingering around, lackeys of the Aries constellation. No doubt. More notifications popped up. Lee Gun frowned, wondering why these followers of the holy gods were acting so high and mighty. He overheard two people walking past talking about him. One of them said they might die from all the chaos surrounding Lee Gun. The other replied that the media couldn't stop talking about him. Still, one of them scoffed, claiming Lee Gun was washed up and questioning why people gave him so much attention. Lee Gun noticed a badge on their shirts. They belonged to the Gemini sect. The two men turned their attention to Lee Gun. The boy, sensing danger, shouted for him to come back before things got ugly, but Lee Gun just stared back calmly, unbothered. One of the men barked, asking what he was looking at, and told him to run along. The boy watched nervously, realizing Lee Gun wasn't even paying attention to who he was dealing with. The man blew smoke in Lee Gun's face, taunting him. "Got a problem?" "Hit me if you do," he said smugly. His companion tried to leave, saying the guy might wet himself, and they both walked off sneering. "It's always those losers who worship Lee Gun," they said. "Why would anyone like the weakest of the saints? It's probably just a lie that he was ever one of them." The boy thanked Lee Gun for holding back, whispering that those two were members of the Gemini constellation and ranked above A-class. But Lee Gun's patience had run dry. With an annoyed expression, he called out, "Hey, you two cockroaches!" The two men turned, surprised. "Cockroaches? Is he talking to us?" Lee Gun's eyes narrowed as he replied, "Yes, you two. Cockroaches." The man walked back toward the protagonist, glaring. He demanded that the MC repeat what he just said, scoffing that he was merely a civilian with no trace of magical energy. But the MC calmly stretched his finger, readying for a flick. Before the man could react, the MC flicked him, sending the man flying through the air, unconscious, crashing into a nearby wall. The girl beside him screamed in shock. The bystanders stared in disbelief. They couldn't comprehend how strong this man, Lee Gun, truly was. Lee Gun then turned his eyes to the girl, calmly stating that he had noticed she was preparing to attack him from behind. Without hesitation, she received the same treatment, flung through the air and slammed into a wall by another flick. Lee Gun stood over the unconscious duo and muttered that they were just a couple of nobodies. From behind, the old man and the boy shouted at him, warning that he couldn't go around using his abilities in the middle of the street like that. But Lee Gun replied flatly that if he had truly used his ability, those two would be dead. That response shocked them even more. Just a finger flick, strong enough to take down A-class Templars. Lee Gun then crouched beside the unconscious man, inspecting a necklace around his neck. After examining it for a moment, he muttered that it all made sense now. It felt different when he struck them, because they were carrying a relic. He frowned, wondering why people like them had relics. Weren't those supposed to be exclusive to saints? The boy explained that Lee Gun really didn't know anything. He told him that decades ago, mankind had nearly been wiped out by a great calamity. It was thanks to the holy gods and the 12 chosen saints that humanity survived. However, the saints couldn't protect the entire world alone, so they gathered followers and formed sects. Those who awakened under the saints' blessings came to be known as Templars. They were ranked by power, saints at the top, followed by cardinals, the next candidates for sainthood, then bishops, the elite among Templars, and finally the Templars themselves. He added that the Templars' faith fueled the power of the holy gods. Because of this, sects competed fiercely to attract followers, and some elite Templars were even granted relics by the gods themselves. Lee Gun processed the information, muttering that a lot had happened in the 20 years he was gone. Suddenly, the boy pointed toward a nearby figure. One of the goat avatars of Ares was staring directly at Lee Gun. Its presence made it clear it wanted blood. In exchange, it promised riches if Lee Gun would just finish the two Templars off. The old man gasped, horrified. He realized that Lee Gun had attracted the attention of the avatars, reflections of the holy gods themselves. Confronting them was the same as defying a god. The old man urged Lee Gun to hurry up and follow their command, but Lee Gun only smiled. He guessed this had to be Ares doing, and it was clear they were trying to fill their bellies, just like their greedy saint. With a smirk, Lee Gun raised his foot, releasing a surge of powerful energy, and then he slammed it into the ground. The earth shook violently. The avatar nearest him shattered instantly, and the entire Ares sect dome collapsed under the force. Standing tall amid the chaos, Lee Gun growled that they should stop fooling around. Even if they were just nobodies to him, the boy stood frozen in awe. The avatars of the Ram constellation had fled. He realized then Lee Gun was no ordinary person. Lee Gun called the boy over, asking if those thugs were from Gemini's Templars. The boy nodded, explaining that Gemini was the most powerful sect in the country, a group made up of business tycoons and elites. That piqued Lee Gun's interest. He asked if they were loaded. The boy blinked, not understanding the slang. Lee Gun's expression turned darkly playful. Glancing at the unconscious Templar's flashy clothes, he muttered that they had to be designer, and with that, he grabbed the man and grinned. "Time for some exciting looting," he sang, humming a cheeky little la-la-la tune as he got to work. They finally arrived at the apartment building. The boy pointed at a unit on the second floor with the lights off. "That's where I live," he said. The old man added that his place was right next door. As they approached, the boy turned and bowed slightly. "Thank you for saving our lives today, and even dropping us off. We really appreciate it." But there was no response. Curious, the boy peeked ahead and was stunned. Lee Gun was already standing in front of their door, looking half asleep. "Aren't we going in?" he asked casually, yawning. The boy froze. Wait, is he planning to stay at our place? Without waiting for permission, Lee Gun walked inside like he owned the place. He picked up a scissor from the corner, gave his overgrown hair a quick trim, and examined himself in the mirror. A rare look of awe crept onto his face. He hadn't expected to see his original features restored. His handsome face, his fit body, it was all back to normal. When he stepped out again, the boy's eyes widened. "You cut your hair! You look really cool now." Lee Gun scratched his head, smiling a little shyly. "Really?" In the past, hair loss had been a side effect of using his powers. Every single strand had been precious. Who would have thought he'd live to see the day he could just casually tidy it up? Suddenly, a loud buzzing sound filled the room. Lee Gun's expression darkened. "What now?" he muttered. Then he spotted it is a mosquito. Why is a disaster misfortune inside the house? Without hesitation, he snatched it midair with one hand and crushed it effortlessly. The boy was amazed. "You caught it? Even experts can't catch those things that easily." Lee Gun frowned. "There are quite a few of them. Why do they keep coming after me?" The boy shrugged. "Maybe you give off a sweet scent that disaster misfortunes like?" Lee Gun didn't seem amused. "Scent? Nah. Usually, this kind of thing happens when there's something inside the house." He scanned the room, and his eyes landed on a shelf of odd, ornamental items. His expression turned cold. "Of course, disaster misfortunes are showing up. You've got these monstrosities lying around." The boy looked confused. "Monstrosities? I got these from the Gemini saint himself." He picked up one of the figures and explained, "They're not even mine!" The saint kissed this one to bless it. Crack! Before he could finish, Lee Gun shattered the figurine without hesitation. The boy dropped to his knees in horror, but Lee Gun just covered his nose, disgusted. "Gross!" He pointed at the various items one by one. "This mask? It's a relic that spies on buyers. That music box? It gathers personal information. And this clock? It attracts disaster misfortunes." He shook his head in disgust. "Those greedy bastards. Even after robbing you blind, they're selling cursed junk to the people." The more he thought about it, the angrier he got. "Throw all of it away," Lee Gun growled. Meanwhile, a boy outside the door had been eavesdropping on the commotion. Lee Gun narrowed his eyes. "Who are you?" Then the stranger spoke, sounding irritated. I'm the owner of this house. Lee Gun blinked. So that's who he was. Elsewhere, within the pristine walls of the White Aries sect, Yang Wei, the sect's leader, was in shock. What did you say? He demanded. The avatars in Korea disappeared? One of his subordinates nodded. Yes, sir. The Korean branch is in complete panic. Yang Wei's brows furrowed. Who could have done such a thing? Avatars are the direct subordinates of the holy gods. Only someone incredibly powerful could repel them. Shall I contact the other saints and ask if any of them were involved? Do it, Yang Wei ordered. What about Sagittarius? Still unreachable, sir. Yang Wei scoffed. Hugo? We don't need to bother with him. He probably ran off to play mercenary in the UK again. But the subordinate shook his head. He left the UK shortly after arriving. Where did he go? Korea. Yang Wei went still. Hugo was Lee Gun's closest friend. The fact that he was on the move now. Could it be tied to the rumors? Yang Wei clenched his jaw. No, there's no way Lee Gun is alive. Furious, he hurled a candlestick at his subordinate. Make a more detailed report. He barked. What else? The subordinate cleared his throat. A Gemini Templar was found unconscious at the scene where the avatars disappeared. According to witnesses, he was lying in the street, in nothing but his underwear. Yang Wei's eye twitched. And? They said he got into a fight with a very handsome man. Yang Wei's expression darkened. Then it wasn't Lee Gun, but deep down the pieces were coming together. If Lee Gun has returned, and the avatars are vanishing, and we even failed to defeat the Spider Queen recently, he clenched his fists. If this continues, my position could be in danger. Prepare my private jet, he ordered. The subordinate looked shocked. You plan to go personally, sir? Yes, I need to see for myself what's happening in Korea. Back in Korea, inside a Gemini-affiliated hospital, an elderly man stood by a bed. A young man lay unconscious, one of the Gemini, Templars who had confronted Lee Gun. This is my grandson, the old man growled. Who did this to him? Standing beside him, another Templar stepped forward. He radiated cold energy. Don't worry, he said calmly. This is exactly why the Gemini sect dispatched me, President. He extended a hand. Min Sung-hoon, S-Class Gemini Templar, codenamed the Freeze.